Hello, friends. We are in a troubling time when it comes to misinformation. Here at Forbidden Knowledge News, I've always taken an unbiased, open-minded, and responsible approach to presenting my own theories, and the views of our guests do not reflect that of my own. This show is for entertainment purposes only, and any information presented during this show is a live-action role-play scenario. Conspiracies are definitely fun to discuss in a responsible way. My suggestion to everyone that has an audience and presents theories and possibilities should present them as such, and in no way present unsubstantiated information as truth. All that being said, enjoy this episode. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Frank Jacob. First, a couple of announcements. Check out Brainsupreme. Start your microdosing journey right now. Visit their website, brainsupreme.co. If you visit brainsupreme.co/discount/FKN15, you get 15% off your entire order, or just use that link right in the description. Great ways to help support Forbidden Knowledge News and help us with our upcoming production. Watch the Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana. That's on Tubi, Roku channel, and multiple streaming platforms. Get a Rokfin premium membership, rokfin.com/FKN+, and always download our audio podcast directly through Spreaker. We are booking guests for December. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Frank Jacob. He is an international award-winning filmmaker, presenter, visual artist, musician, and composer. His recent films and research explore the frontiers of consciousness-raising subjects. Frank, welcome back. How you doing?
Good to see you, Chris. Yeah, I'm doing good. Been a crazy time. And you have a new president.
Yes, it is a crazy time.
New old president.
New old president.
New president.
Very, I'll say just interesting things unfolding right now, to say the least. Now, today we're going to talk about your online webinar, Time Capsule for the Future Past. This is what we're all about here. It examines humanity's hidden history, origins of the parasitic ruling class, what could be behind that, and all sorts of ancient esoteric knowledge, as well as where it has led humanity, and maybe where we could be possibly headed in the future. And like I said, I'm very excited about this. I love these topics. Before we dive too deep into this, though, it's been a while since you've been on. Remind the audience a little bit about yourself and your work.
Oh, okay. Well, sure. Why not? It's a good place to start. Well, how did we meet the first time? Was it after my Looking Glass
It was
stuff,
before
or
that.
was
It was
before?
before
Right? Before that, right? We were talking about my film
Packing
from
for
Mars,
Mars.
maybe.
That's it. That's the first time.
Could be Packing from Mars. Well, okay, so that's a good place to jump in. So I am the director of a film called Packing from Mars, which was released almost going on 10 years ago now, and that was a film that explored the crazy world of the premise that was put forth by Leslie Watkins, the British author, investigative journalist back then, called Alternative 3, which was itself a novel version of a sort of a mockumentary put out by a English science report show that kind of talked about a breakaway civilization setting up colony on Mars. So that set me on a, well, I mean, I didn't plan on making a film about it, but it kind of became the topic for me to venture into doing my first sort of cinematic version. I've been making films and I come out of the music business. So I wanted to make something which was, rich and, like cinematic worthy. You could sit in a theater and watch it because a lot of these fringe topics are underproduced. The videos at that time were really garbled looking. So I thought, okay, well, here I have the ability to do this. So why not? And that sort of set me onto a trajectory. Okay, that's a good word for it. Leading into kind of this fringe material, for better or for worse. And I try to keep my feet on the ground, and my head up in the clouds, so I can explore kind of, these ideas, and yet still try to kind of find something you can hold on to, something that makes it, plausible, or what would be, what part of it would make it plausible, and just to kind of keep us from, going way out there, because as we know, since then, there's been so many way out ideas about secret space programs and whatnot. So you don't even really know what's true anymore. And we know that there's a massive movement out there of disinformation as well. So that after that, a lot of series of things happened. We released a film called Solar Revolution, Klaus Donner Chronicles, a lot of talks, a lot of live appearances, and eventually started to venture into webinars as a result of a crazy story I covered about something called the Guardians of the Looking Glass, which then went into the tangent of that looking glass technology, and time travel and parallel worlds and past future interactions and things like that. Those are topics that fascinate me. So that's how that whole thing started, and ever since then I've been venturing down that avenue, because webinars seem to be a lot easier, or let's say not easier. Actually, they're not easier at all. What am I saying? They're difficult. I mean, they're hard in terms of the research, but they're faster to produce than a film is, because film requires, setting appointments, filming things, editing it all, making it look pretty and stuff. And we are releasing a film actually right now. It's called The Extraterrestrial Species Almanac with Craig Campobasso and my partner Tanya Maidenford. So that one's coming out. Look for it. It's going to be out there soon. So that's my world, crazy fringe stuff and all those topics. And I try to kind of keep myself abreast of, what's going on and how to tie current events into these amazing informations, and of course, the latest thing being Gnosticism.
Yes. There has been a huge resurgence of Gnostic understandings and research into this, and I really love what you're doing and what you've been doing. You're paving the way for a lot of creative endeavors and people who were on the fence about starting things, because I think right now is the time for people like yourself, from myself, to take over the entertainment space, because it's crumbling. People are seeing what's really behind it. It's not even about entertainment anymore. It's about propaganda. It's about brainwashing. And independent creators like yourself and many others that have started to come out of the woodwork and produce their own content is becoming way more popular than a lot of the mainstream bullshit that we're subjected to right now. So it's a very, very exciting time that we're in. Now, go ahead.
Totally. Yeah, you're right. No, I agree with you. I agree. And that's actually part of the motivation to make webinars, because they're like courses, like it's like deep dive. You want to go into it like a film. Okay, an hour and a half, you can only cover so much in 70 to 90 minutes. But like a course, you can really take the time and explore stuff and work through the material, because a lot of the stuff is actually, it's hard for people to grasp some of this stuff. So it's good to kind of spend a little more time, to work through it. Anyway,
yeah, 100%.
I wanted to say that.
Give us a synopsis of the webinar, and we'll kind of break down the sections and dissect it a little bit as we go.
Well, essentially, I started to, look at doing a webinar about kind of a favorite topic of mine I've been inserting little bits of it into the webinars. It has to do with timelines and and fake history. Or let's just say revisionist history being the antidote to fake history. And revisionist history is a, kind of a dangerous word. It's almost like a, four-letter word in a lot of circles because, revision implies that you revise something and you rework it. And I think we're living in a time now, and you touched on it a little bit, that we're tired of the mainstream media because we're realizing we've been fed a lot of propaganda. And you can realize, and you can understand, I think anyone can understand that if it's clear to you that what you're seeing in the current events on the mainstream media and is it propaganda, then, well, by extrapolation, you can kind of go back in time and realize that at a time when we had no internet and maybe one or two sources of news, the tendency to be disinformed was exponentially higher than it is now. So I'm going back kind of like a consciousness archaeologist, just sort of going into mine those events and trying to rework them, because I think we need to heal. Society needs to heal to move forward, because if we're going to create, everyone's talking about the fifth dimension, the new world and all this stuff, but if we're bringing all our baggage with us into this new timeline, into this new world, it's not going to help us. We're just going to keep repeating the same, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse. So let's go back and let's revisit some of these key events and see how they shaped society. And if they aren't true, then, we need to make corrections. And so for me, history was one of the ways I wanted to do it. And I came across some, very, very potent revisionist facts relating to the origins of World War II. And, being in Germany, it's a very dangerous topic to be talking about that here, especially in terms of revision. So I have to always be very careful and mindful how I phrase things, because I don't want, the thought police to come knocking on my door. And that does happen over here, So, yeah. But I wanted to put this out there, and because I think it's important, it's not just for German people, but people all over the world, because we've all built the paradigm of the modern world that we're living in now off of the 20th century historical events. And if they're false, then I want to know about it. And I want to tell people what I've found, so that they can look at the material for themselves and adjust accordingly. But just to put it out like a dry historical, it's a riveting topic, but I kind of felt like I wanted to tie it into more of a 40,000 foot perspective, more of the spiritual element to it. I stumbled onto some, by total fluke, some information that ties into what I mentioned earlier, Gnosticism. And in fact, because, you find out about, if you're going back in time and you're looking at, paradigms that were created for us to move society in a certain direction, those paradigms are usually built on some source material. And, they claim, origin, right? Like in Germany, there's the word for it. It's called Quelle, it's like, what is the source? Where does the spring come out of the ground, right? That's kind of where you want to be tapping your information. And what I found out was that the Gnostic material that was uncovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi has actually not really been explained, in a way that is true or neutral to what was truly found. And one author in particular out there, a guy called John Lamb Lash, fell in my path, and I was actually watching a video or two of his related to something totally different. And then I let it, sit there for a while, and I worked on some other things. And then suddenly this little voice came back to me and said, "Hey, you want to go check out some other stuff?" And that's when I kind of stumbled on his take. And then I realized that, okay, wait a minute, there's another take on the Gnostic material, which I thought I knew a little bit about. And I realized what I knew about Gnosticism is wrong. Okay, wrong, it's a strong word, right? But like the Gnostics like to say, there is no evil, there is only error, right? So there is error in terms of what people believe the Gnostics were, and what Gnosticism is, because most of the people that have revealed what Gnosticism's about are scholars who are part of the the educational system. They went to university, they have doctorates, and they're usually tied into some, theocratic, structure based on the Abrahamic religions for the most part, right? Because they always tend to tie the Gnostics into the early Christian days, right? 2,000 years
Yeah.
ago. And so they took the find at Nag Hammadi, those scholars, and it's like if you can imagine, there's a good analogy John makes about it. It's like you find a pile of Legos, of the source Legos, right? And why isn't everybody putting out the same material, right? It's one of the first questions, a legitimate question. Why does not all of it sort of point in the same direction? Well, you find out that the people that are part of that, you know, um, preordained way of thinking are going to try and fit what they find in those teachings, the source materials. They're going to look for the fragments that coincide with what they've been studying and researching, and whatever doesn't fit, they're going to sort of, like when you're a filmmaker, you just cut it out, it lands on the cutting room floor, as they say, right? So a lot of really amazing material was left on the cutting room floor, and that's the kind of stuff that actually Lash picked up, and he sort of took an approach like, let's look at them for what they were and not for what these, Judeo-Christian people are trying to, make sense of in that material. And that's when the real picture of the Gnostics emerges. And that's the most fascinating part. So that part for me, and the critical part of that, I think, has to do with an underlying force that's been moving and sort of in the background of humanity since the very beginning, corrupting the path that we're on. And he's the person that sort of brought that term back into circulation, the Archons. We've all heard that word, the Archons, and I didn't really know, where it came from. I just started hearing the word Archons about 15 years ago or so, and I realized now that it was Lash that reintroduced that word, because he found all kinds of material in the Gnostic Nag Hammadi writings about the Archons, treaties strictly devoted. About, I think, 20% of the writings are devoted to just that one topic. So wow, like 1/5 of that topic is about Archons, and no one's talking about it. Like, amazing, right? So that was like, for me, okay. And when I read that and I realized, okay, wait a minute, here is kind of like you put the dots, you connect the dots, because I'm looking at World War II, and what kind of a force would be behind an event as brutal and bloody as that? Like, what is really behind it? And so those two seemingly diverse topics on one end of the spectrum, ancient knowledge and ancient source material matched up with current modern material, actually, I brought those two together, and that's what this webinar is all about.
Excellent. That's a great introduction to it. How far back should we look when trying to get a better understanding of some of these Gnostic beliefs, and what new understandings, maybe you could share a few that have come up for you through the research?
Well, how far back? Yeah, I mean, the thing is that you find out that, like, you can throw away the idea that the Gnostics were these early Christians. You find out that there's several branches of Gnosticism, and what most people identify with Gnosticism in terms of the Christianity aspect, like esoteric Christian sect of kind of like, esoteric freaks that are busy trying to introduce ideas into Christianity. Well, that's one aspect of it, but that's something you might actually call Valentinian Gnosticism, because there was this guy called Valentine, and he brought in aspects of true Gnosticism, but because the Gnostics were being literally persecuted, eradicated, wiped off the surface of the earth, he conformed the material to fit into the Christian narrative. And so and that's what has survived for the most part. And that's what people for the most part think that Gnostics are. But what actually happened is that the Gnostic teachings preceded that time by about estimates of around 4,000 years, right? So we're talking about 6,000 years ago. And they didn't call themselves Gnostics. That's a term that the church fathers called them, because we think of the word gnosis as meaning to know, like knowledge, spiritual knowledge. But to the Christians, it was more of a slander term, like smartass, the know-it-alls, right? So they actually called themselves telestai. And the telestai were like, if you could think of the intellectual mystics of the ancient times, they would practice mysticism. They would do entheogenic substances, and they would also not do them. But there was thousands of years of precursor to 2,000 years ago, where they had developed a deep understanding of these other reality, other levels of reality, and that was documented in the Library of Alexandria, for example, was one of the great sources of that information that was gathered and collected. And it was, you can imagine, I mean, they had artifacts, they had maps, the writings, I mean, the rich tapestry of knowledge that ancient humanity had gathered. They accumulated it, they sorted it, they cataloged it, they preserved it, and they protected it, and they taught it. But of course, it was contradictory to the emerging idea of Christianity. So the main difference, you might say, between the Gnostics that I learned, I think that's the hardcore thing, is the Gnostics didn't believe in the Abrahamic version of the off-planet Yahweh. For them, they were around at a time where they knew what was behind this off-planet alien god, and they saw that as the Archons. And so their idea of Yahweh and the Elohim and Melchizedek is basically a demented alien off-planet god posing as a god, but being a fake god, and basically duping certain people at that time to adhere, like making promises, right? And this is where something comes about that they call master race ideology. So there's one race which is chosen by the Yahweh, right, to be the inheritor of the planet, right? And this is an ideology which has, of course, informed all of the Abrahamic religions. And here were the Gnostics saying, nope, guys, that's all just fake. Forget it. Don't get into it. It's about our knowledge. We don't pass information along through bloodlines. We don't have authority issued through bloodlines. We have authority issued through knowledge. We pass knowledge about our true history, knowledge about the reality on, and that's where you gain power, not through, bloodlines or fake kingships and stuff like that. So, of course, you can understand that at a time where this was trying to get to sort of set roots along, the Gnostics were a pain in the butt for these people. And so this is why they began to basically eradicate them. And unfortunately, that resulted in the burning down of the Library of Alexandria, the legendary, as they say. Who knows if it was all burned down, but we know maybe a large part of it is now in the Vatican. But, the key word here is that information was literally disappeared from the planet, and the only fragments we have left of it are what they found at Nag Hammadi in 1945. So that's a good starting place right there.
I can definitely understand why there is a re-emergence in interest in some of these Gnostic concepts, because we're starting to realize how fundamentally parasitic and anti-human most of the systems are that govern our reality. And it's hard to imagine that someone that is human would be able to carry out a lot of the agendas. They seem so anti-human, exactly. And it's only natural that people would gravitate towards, oh, well, that would mean that our reality may be controlled by some non-human intelligence. And it's easy for many to come to that conclusion right now just because of the way our reality's set up.
Totally, and I think this is a point. This is going to be a point of great contention in the future, because if there's this. I mean, you've probably noticed it, and when I was doing my deep dive into this material, I noticed that John Nolan was coming out with this, religious stuff about Buglini, Mario Buglini. And he was talking about the interpretation of certain words in the Bible being, he represented them in terms of what their definition might be in context of an extraterrestrial influence, right? And then, of course, on top of that, we have the whole outcropping of the Anunnaki story, which, of course, was literally, you could say, set in motion by, I think Zachariah Sitchin is probably a safe bet. And, Jordan Maxwell and others gravitated to his research. And it kind of grew from there, that there's this sort of, off-planet alien intrusion on our planet, And I think the point here that's going to be difficult to navigate is going to be because these stories on the Sumerian cuneiform tablets, which are considered the oldest written form of the historical record of humanity, indicate that there was this this extraterrestrial element, or you could say this the gods from the sky kind of thing, right? But you got to realize that that material in itself was written by, well, whom? It would be obviously the kings of those days would have court scribes, right? And a lot of those court scribes were mystics. And so the kings had them, to memorialize them, their lives and their legacies for all time. They had them present themselves, of course, in this light, right? But there's no way to determine whether that information was true or not. It was just put down by the court scribes, and it's going to be very biased. So, the Gnostics, they basically came forward at a time when this material was getting out there, and they said, no, that's disinfo. Actually, this is not true. There was no, the Anunnaki for them were the Archons. And the Archons are indeed an alien species, and they are definitely off planet, but they are not a superior species to the human race. They are a mimetic species, and they are an offshoot of the whole creation process of what came to be planet Earth and the Anthropos, which then is us. And that story has a whole backstory, which was documented in the Nag Hammadi materials, called the Fallen Goddess Scenario, which John Lash reconstructed from the fragments that were left behind. And that really makes it clear that this alien presence is one that's not based on superior technology or whatever. It's based on mimicry of what they're envious of. And they're envious of the creative ability of humanity. And humanity is actually the peach, we're it. And planet Earth is the destination. And this idea is, of course, very controversial these days because everyone's trying to get us off planet, right? They tell us that the Gnostics said we're all sparks, we have a spark of divinity and we're on a prison planet and we need to get off this planet. But that, again, is the false version of Gnosticism. The true message of Gnosticism, when you reconstruct it, is that, nope, we were actually brought here by our creator mother, Sophia, who actually turned herself into this planet and created a habitat for us to blossom and allow that genius potential to bear fruit. And it's been stopped and stunted and interfered with and manipulated from the get-go by this external alien presence, which is the Archons, which are a stunted version of humanity. But they preceded us, and they're excellent at doing something called, the Gnostic, the Coptic word for it is called hal, which is to use simulation to trick us into believing things. And if they can trick us into believing something, then it's almost as good as it's actually being true. But there's a difference between something being true and just being tricked into believing something is true, right? So this is one of the main points, I think, of contention that we're going to have to work through to get to the truth of the whole story.
I consider many different perspectives from researchers that I've had on the show, and recently there's many that consider a different possibility when it comes to what the Archons are. Mainly that they could be some sort of archetypal or spiritual intelligence rather than extraterrestrial, something that may reside in layers of our reality that we can't perceive, some sort of energetic intelligence that has the effect to control our perception and interact with us in different ways, but may not necessarily be a physical entity.
Well, I mean, the question always is, where are they deriving the material that they're basing those ideas on, right? Is it channeled information? Is it just inspiration? If you really want to find the first written indication of what the Archons were defined as, it's there for us to read, right? It's right there in the Nag Hammadi, the true story, untarnished by anything. It's like, and they describe who they are. They're both a physical and a mental presence. They're also outside of our they also embody, you could say, the astral spheres, right? So they are able to mess with our minds, and in fact, the ability for them to penetrate into our bubble, into our biosphere, is limited. They do try it. They do it. In fact, there's actually accounts, Chris, of them abducting people over 2,000 years ago, right? So this is one of the things that blew my mind. So like I think I'm open to all of this stuff. We need to discuss it all, but we should always look at where the source material came from and what it's telling us before we discount anything, right? So if we already have material that goes back 6,000 years that is telling us about this presence that is both in the mental and in the physical realms, but only limited to able to penetrate into our physical realm, but the danger being the mental part of it, that's something we should look at and read and see what's written there. And that's what I think is so fascinating about that story, because these tales of abduction, they're actually on record. And they actually even have instructions where certain of the teachers are telling Gnostics, the Gnostic students, like, look, you're going to encounter them. They're going to show up. Now, there's going to be about 3 of them. And they're going to look like, there's 2 types that they could look like. One of them is going to look like an embryonic human with a spindly, skinny body, giant head, and big eyes, like a aborted fetus in a way. And the other is going to look reptilian. And those are the 2. Actually, it's interesting that those are the primary 2 entities which we kind of first became accustomed to in the 20th century when people began talking about abduction scenarios, right? And then the whole reptilian agenda we hear a lot about these days in the UFO circles, right? Well, guess what? They already identified them over 2,000 years ago, and they documented the encounters with those beings, and they warned us how to deal with them. And they told us specific instructions on how to deal with them. So I think that's really fascinating.
100%. Now, I'd like to get into World War II a little bit and how these events may have indicated the archonic presence and what was really behind what unfolded during that time period.
Well, we know, I think that one of the 2 prime antagonistic forces in the Second World War were the Germans and the Jewish people, right? So if you look at the origins of the archonic penetration into our realm, in terms of the Abrahamic religions, then you see that it was through Abraham that the first contact was made. And there's a whole story about how they were able to penetrate into the neural network of Abraham and begin to formulate, or like vicariously program, their agenda of interference. And their interference, of course, has to do with, this master race ideology and the idea of creating conflict between the human races. Because if they can keep us fighting each other constantly, we are never going to, reach a point where there's peace and we can fully develop in absolute peace and harmony on the planet our full potential. So that began then. And that ideology, which is embodied in something they also found a year and a half after they found the Nag Hammadi, they found that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've probably heard of them. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about a specific group of people that were living around the Dead Sea, and they were called the Tzaddik. And the Tzaddik basically were the ones where this ideology of the savior, of, it's written, the whole idea of Melchizedek, right? The word Tzaddik is built right into Melchizedek, right? The righteous ones, the chosen ones, right? This was kind of a mal program that was put into human consciousness. And it kept going and going and going, and developed, of course, into the Roman Catholic religion, right? And then, of course, took, into the Judeo branch of it, and then the Christian branch of it, the Judeo branch, of course, being the chosen people, the Christian being the rapture, right? If you're righteous, you'll be taking off planet, right? So forget the planet. It's all in sin. Humanity's in sin. All these ideas, they came from the Tzaddik, right? And so this is kind of a malware that was implanted into the neural net of the human species. And it grew over hundreds, of course, and thousands of years. And eventually, you had a situation where in Germany, there was the Jewish people and the German people were living together for centuries in total peace. Everyone minded their own business, did their own thing. And it was only as a result of this ideology that, hey, wait a minute, like, we've been like, pushed around, kicked around, we've been kicked out of countries. We want our own country, right? And of course, it's very expensive to kind of get your own country. You can't just sort of go and buy it. So there had to be some overwhelming presence to be able to get people to like some argument that, that is superhuman that would enable them to justify staking claim on a particular piece of land. And I think we all know what piece of land that is. In fact, it's sort of, right in our faces right this day, right now. It's come back and it's the big, conflict going down in the Middle East again, right? It had its roots there and it has its conclusion there. And the object of the Archons has always been to create an apocalyptic, like absolute showdown. If we can destroy ourselves in absolute mayhem, all right, we've done it, right? So this idea began to, really like take another level of dimension. There were several stages. I describe it in the webinar. I interviewed John Lash throughout the whole thing, and he's got some very, very interesting perspectives in terms of moments in history where there was an escalation of certain ideologies and certain ideas that really kind of set us off on a crazy trajectory. And the last one, of course, being the Second World War. And that was preceded by the First World War, which is kind of the precursor to why we even had a Second World War, which many people believe was actually just a simple continuation of the First World War with a 30-year pause in the middle. So, what you find out essentially is that this idea of, using that predestined, chosen people ideology to support, getting people to manipulate each other in order to provide a home base, worked perfectly hand in hand with that ideology. And that kind of set in motion a kind of betrayal between those two people, because they really did live and prosper and benefit from each other, because both of them have incredible amounts of genius. I mean, it's undisputable that those two peoples, the Germanic race and the Jewish race, have a certain inherent genius, which is related. But because of this malware put in them, they faced off. And that really erupted into the Second World War and became to the point that it developed into something that really just worked more behind the scenes than anything else. What we found out about the causes of the Second World War are actually not really the causes of the Second World War. And that's the material that I really get deeply into.
A few minutes ago, you said that the end goal of these beings is to most likely get us to destroy ourselves. Well, there's many that believe that we're basically food for these beings. While they may be trying to cull the herd a little bit, they ultimately need us to feed off of us and for us to produce for them, because some believe they have no creative spark, that they need us to be the creators for them because they do not have the same abilities for them. And the end goal may be just to trap us in a matrix within a matrix that's pretty much self-regulated by some sort of AI programming.
Well, I mean, the idea that they're feeding off of us is totally in line with what is, talked about, what the Gnostics talk about. They feed on fear for the primary element. They feed on the emotions of fear. And the idea to kind of keep us enslaved in a place where they can continually feed off of us, that has to do with what I said earlier, that word hal, the Coptic word for simulation. So they're trying to create the illusion that we are living a certain way, that we have certain limitations, that we have certain problems, and they keep repeating that in various new versions. Like, for example, just the idea of of abiogenesis, which is, the method that they use to penetrate on a nano level past the blood-brain barrier, 1850 BC, if you want to get specific, is repeated in the way you could say in the mRNA Beetlejuice syndrome that we had, we lived through 4 years ago. It's the same MO, right? It's like penetrate beyond the blood-brain barrier. And if you can get inside our minds and you can convince us of something, then you've won. Now, the idea of us, like, just, to get us to live inside of a matrix and a matrix, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could say that, how deep do you want to take your matrix, But in the end, it isn't real. It's just a simulation. What's real is we are real. Everything that is of any value and consequence is material. And that's also very explicitly stated. Everything that's going on, everything that matters, it happens in the material realm. This is where the action happens. And this is why everyone's always lined up to come here, right? Because this is where it goes down, right? I mean, you can do very little if you're kind of in an astral plane, except you can try to affect and influence and live vicariously. So, I mean, I think that right now there's a lot of dialogue going on about simulation. I've talked to John Nolan about this as well. He's exploring it, with the idea that, we totally live in a simulation, that this is a simulation. But my question always is then, that means that everything that you're picking up and registering, do you believe that is purely a simulation? And, and you have to ask yourself, is that all? Everything I'm picking up with my senses, is that a simulation? And the next question you might want to ask yourself is, what is it simulating? Right? Like, well, what, for there to be a simulation, you have to have something it simulates, right? So that's a kind of a big question to answer. And, what is it simulating? If you can answer that, you're going to come to the point where you might ask yourself, well, if it is a simulation, who is generating it? Right? Well, who, and why simulate something if it's indistinguishable from what is real? Right? What's the difference between a simulation and reality?
Right.
Can you answer that question? And how can you tell the difference between reality and a simulation? Mm-hmm. How can you tell the difference, right? Good question, right? Because if you don't know that answer, then you can't be talking about this as a simulation because you haven't even grasped what reality is yet. Because for you to be able to say, hey, I'm in a simulation, well, then you have to have a familiarity with reality. So, what is reality? That's another very big question. And if everyone's talking about getting away from here, this is another beef I have with this thing. I wrote an article on it. Like, they talk about we need to get off the prison planet. Again, one of the false statements attributed to the Gnostics. We're not trying to get off a prison planet. Actually, planet Earth is Sophia and she's the destination. But, if you can get us to believe we need to go away from this planet, what a great MO. You've gotten us off the planet. You've gotten us off where we're supposed to be to manifest that ultimate beautiful world that we're actually endowed with, to sense, to perceive. The other aspect that comes into this is something that I talk about in the webinar as well, in the first part, which is actually called Sophia, because, if you want to believe these kind of creation stories that the Gnostics put down in the Nag Hammadi, which sound like pure science fiction in a lot of ways, you have to understand a little bit about a new model of the universe for it to even make any sense. And that's one of the things that I think was important to get into, and that's why I got into it. And that has to do with two things. One of it is the idea of plasma and the plasma universe. What is plasma, right? And the other thing is something called the electric universe. Some iteration of the electric universe model works in tandem with the idea that we're living in a plasma universe. And I think that the cutting edge of science right now is quietly working on the reality that everything, 99.9% of everything out there is plasma. So that kind of, and plasma is, some people call it the fourth state of matter. It's pre-particle. So particles don't really exist. So the whole idea of particle science, the Big Bang, dark matter, dark energy, all these models, they fall flat. In fact, they have fallen flat. And if you look at all the billions of research that they've put into it, they can find no trace of them, no trace of black matter, no trace of black energy. And the more they look, the deeper they look into the relativity theory, the more bankrupt it is. But there's an easy explanation. Look at the universe as plasma and in an electric universe where everything is conscious. And there was a scientist in Russia a plasma scientist, one of the leading scientists. And he, in his own experiments in a lab setting, proved that plasma spontaneously develops into a conscious organism. Now you can imagine if you can prove that in a lab, in a little teeny lab experiment, that thing turns into kind of a creepy super AI, right? Then extrapolate that to everything is plasma. So the bigger the plasma organism, the more conscious it is. And plasma organisms are, if you look at the universe, you can actually, if you look into the to the infrared spectrum of the universe, and you see these filaments appear. And if you put them up against the pictures of the neural network of a human brain, you have a micro-macrocosm mirror, a fractal replication of what's going on in our minds, right? And we know a little bit about the idea of fractality with respect to microcosm equaling macrocosm. It's just a matter of scale. So if there's a plasma consciousness in a lab in some guy's lab in Russia, then you can imagine that the sun as a plasma being, as an entity, is far more conscious and powerful than anything we can even imagine. And so if we begin to look in terms of consciousness beings, the earth is a conscious being, the sun is a conscious being. In fact, the Gnostics they described it in terms of a three-body system. They said the ideal system for consciousness to thrive, for humanity, the anthropos to thrive, is in a three-body system comprising the sun, the planet, and a moon. And that's actually what we have. And if you look at the sun and the moon and the earth within the rest of the solar system, it's a unique system. It doesn't fit with any of the others other than raw materials, right? The inorganic substances which are comprising the other planetary bodies are found on the earth, but the earth is unique in that way. And the earth is unique because, according to the Gnostics, Sophia actually became the earth. There was no earth before the solar system was existing. This is the most fascinating part of the story. So you wrap all that into it and you talk about simulation. Well, simulation to me falls far flat from being able to explore some of these aspects of tangibility. And if I can add one other aspect to the plasma thing, if we are, there's three states of plasma. There's the dark plasma, which we can't perceive with our senses, with our eyes. We actually only see a very small spectrum. I think most people can understand that. Then there's the glowing plasma, which is what we see, all the plasma that we see, or if we look out into space with the Hubble telescope, we see those incredible looking galaxy spiral arms and stuff, millions of them and billions of them, right? That's glowing plasma. And then we have the third state, which is blazing plasma. And that's where you see things like a sun. A sun is essentially a blazing plasma entity. And it's connected, if you could see the neural nodes connecting it to the rest of the galaxy, and you look at the neural nodes within our brain, you see sun-like clusters of glowing energy within our brain as well that could equate to the way our sun equates to us on a macro scale. So when you start looking at it that way, you realize that what happens to you then when you die, right? Because a lot of people are dealing with that question, what happens after? Well, if you listen to Robert Temple, I mean, he's got some really amazing points. He's a scientist and an author talking about a lot of this stuff. He talks about how you leave the active state, the glowing state of plasma, and you revert to the invisible state of plasma. You don't disappear. You just kind of go out of the vision. And so, you actually tap into the neural net of plasma outside of the human visible spectrum. And this would explain a lot of stuff, Chris, right? Because people are talking about connecting with their relatives beyond the veil, right? There's Pitstick and Schwartz that are developing the phone to actually connect with the people. How would that work? And well, it would be really well explained if you looked at it in terms of plasma and the electric universe.
100%. You mentioned the afterlife, and I recently had David Icke on, and it was a very kind of depressing outlook of what could be on the other side, especially if we are subjected to archonic forces. He believes that when we die, essentially, we are being recycled by these entities, and the life review is nothing more than a false review by these archonic entities that present themselves as beings of light to try and deceive us. There's many different perspectives on what could possibly happen, but to me, that's a kind of depressing outlook if we're constantly recycled, and there is essentially no way to reach the afterlife.
Well, I think what's missing in David Icke's argument is our connection with Sophia. He never mentions it, and he talks about Gnostic materials, but as far as I can source his material, he's referencing the incomplete Gnostic material. He talks about the divine spark. That's not a Gnostic term. That's a Talmudic term. The divine wisdom goddess of Sophia, she imparted with us and endowed us with certain divine qualities like enoia, and we have the ability to create. You mentioned it. We're creator beings, right? We've been given these creator abilities through our senses to explore. So, we don't really understand our relationship with Sophia yet, that we actually emerged from this aeonic experiment from the center of our galaxy through this being who was paired up with a male counterpart, which is still in the center of the being. So we have an origin at the center of our galaxy in the outside, or you could say an extraterrestrial origin, but we also have an origin here on this planet because we are the children of this experiment put in motion by Sophia. And if you look at the Gaia paradigm, which Lovelock and Margulis brought out in the late 70s, it actually is a scientific explanation of what the Gnostics were talking about, that the Earth is a living, breathing, conscious being, and that all organisms on the planet's surface work together in harmony to indefinitely and perpetually keep that system, that being going. And we have something which we call a species self-identity, right? So if you're identifying yourself as on an ego level, as an individual point, an individual spark, then you're kind of losing out a little bit on the idea that we're like a force of nature as humanity. Like we're connected. All of us are connected, and we're connected to the body of the earth. And that's where we draw our power from. And when you see it that way, you get more in touch with the fact that, hey, you've got abilities here. You've got power here. You've got potential, and you've got creative abilities that you can actually manifest things here on the planet with that you haven't even realized yet. But in the meantime, you're so caught up in the internet and telephones and handies and mobile phones. You guys say mobile phones in America. We say handy in Germany. All these things they're tools for narcissism, man. You can just get so lost. Right. And I think a lot of people that are proposing some of these ideas, they spend too much time in front of the computer screen, man. You need to get out into nature and connect with Sophia and make that connection and begin a dialogue. And you realize that, wow, there's so much more to life that we haven't even realized yet. So to get caught up in this dialogue of the life review and we got to come back. Oh my God, we got to come back here again. I mean, that's just a really narrow way of looking at the full potential we have as human beings. And, as the anthropos, we're supposed to sort of blossom and flower these genius abilities into the world. And yet we're still fighting each other. We still need religion as a crutch. We're still waiting for Jesus to come back and save us because we're all sinners. I mean, like, what are we, children, man? It's time to wake up and become like empowered as humanity and love each other as what we are. We are a powerful force of nature called humanity, called the anthropos. And we are here together in multiple races. We have multiple forms of expression, forms of language, culture, and depending on where we live geographically, we develop and adapt, novel ways of interacting with the universe. And instead of taking us down and trying to conquer each other, which is what the Archon influence has been all about since the beginning, we need to shake off the Archons, see through the illusion, the simulation, the deception, and realize what is reality and what's at stake. And once we do that, I mean, all of those people that are doing it, they see it very clearly. You're talking about new systems of monetary systems, getting away from fractional banking, the Federal Reserve being one of them, for example, free energy, systems that have been invented and cast aside. The whole idea of the battle of the sexes is erroneous because women are, it's funny because if you look at the Gnostics and the Telestai, they were always egalitarians. Women were totally on par with men. In fact, they always had an equal number of both men and women in their sessions where they would go into trance or they would have mystic experience and they would or in their teaching, their teachers were women. I mean, the whole pagan aspect of our existence, which came out of Europe, came out of the Ural Mountains and blossomed into the, and basically up into the European areas that eventually migrated over into America. This whole idea of the paganist, the pagan connection with Earth, there's remnants of it, of that high culture left over. We look at them and go, "Wow, how did they build that Stonehenge or those pyramids?" Right? Well, that was us, man. We were there. We created it, but there was this powerful influence through the Archons, which we couldn't shake off. We haven't shaken it off yet. And the reason I think that is because Sophia herself is a being, she's also evolving. And so the thing is, I think we've reached a point, and this is apparently where it's going with Gnosticism, the new Gnosticism, the modern Gnosticism, is to rebond with Sophia and begin to work together, because essentially both of them, both we, the Anthropos, humanity, and the Gaia, planetary being, are evolving. And at some point, we're going to make a connection that's so powerful that we're going to shake off those Archons. And in fact, that's written in the Nag Hammadi as well. There's Sophia like sternly rebukes the reptilian Archon Yaldabaoth and says, "No, you are not. There's going to be a divine luminous being that's child of the universe, and that is going to rise, and it's going to be like you were never there, and it'll pound you back into the clay as if you never existed." So I think that's where we're headed. So I don't think it's, for me, getting caught up in the simulation, the recycle thing. I think that's like, for me, it's like a distraction, honestly. I think we have many more places we can go, much more powerful information we could be sharing with each other right now. But I can understand where I was coming from. I'm just a little bit disappointed that he didn't really go the full distance in terms of the Gnostic material, because how could he have not seen it? It was right there the whole time.
Well,
right?
This is why we're having this conversation, and I think this is a great segue into where we could be headed. And you said something that has been echoed on this show often recently, that the archonic rulership may be coming to an end. I've had psychics, I've had channelers, I've had intuitives that most of them, I'd say almost 80% of them, have the same message, that this force is coming to an end, that humanity is reaching an awareness point where it's time to pull up our big boy pants and start taking accountability as a human race, realizing we're all one, shedding this illusion of separation that's causing all the conflict, and rejecting the archonic forces. And this comes through so often that it gives me hope, and I have to consider it.
Well, look, I mean, you just had an election. We mentioned it at the top, right? Trump won. And, he's got this dream team, right? So you've got the framework there. I mean, look, let's not be too like lost in the, like the fantasy of what, Trump is, like the savior. This is that savior mentality. We need to shake that. But you do have the structure of a dream team there, right? You've got people that are relatively smart. Robert F. Kennedy's been fighting legal battles against pharmaceutical corporations. He's the ideal guy to actually rehash all these structures that you've got in place in America and the health system, which is crippling you, right? So, and then you've got like guys like, Musk, I guess, is going to be part of it, right? So Musk is, the technological aspect, but, his dark side, of course, being the AI aspect. And, the Starlink aspect, and there's 30,000 satellites which are polluting and clogging the electromagnetic field of the Earth and getting in the way of a natural connection to the cosmos. So you've always got those two things. So those are things we need to hold them accountable to.
Also, the Trump relationship with Israel's a big thing for me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, excuse me. I didn't thank you for mentioning it. But yeah, people are a little bit out of touch with that. I mean, look, like who's the guy that's his transition guy? I mean, excuse me. I mean, look, like that, the chosen person narrative, the chosen people narrative is still very deeply embedded in that. So I think it's important for us to call them out on it. Do they want to be the dream team that's going to transform America and the planet by extension? Absolutely, I'm behind it. But call them on their BS. Hold them to the flame. That's the only way to do it. But we can only do that if we have eyes wide open. This is why we talk about this stuff about AI and look, Peter Thiel's the guy who's, built up JD Vance, right? Look into his history, right? You get into software hacks like Promise, which was able to get into underneath the spy network and spy on politicians and pull their pants down. You got ties into the whole Epstein thing. I mean, there's like some dark stuff going on there, Chris, right? So call them on it, right? Make it transparent, because transparency, the Archons cannot live in a transparent, they cannot handle it when you expose it. It's the exposing of it. And the Gnostics, I think, have information about that as well. They talk about in the end, their end game is going to be, they're going to have to reveal themselves to us. They will have to reveal themselves to us. And they will, because they're liars and deceivers, they'll try to deceive even there. But if we're ready for it and we're looking for it and we're smart to the MO that they've used for thousands of years, I mean, Lord knows how long we've had time to, to practice the being the victims to their deception, right? At some point now, we got to say, okay, the teacher is superseded by the student. And so they've been great teachers, and I think it's also important to see the Archons as our teachers. They, another definition of Archon is the rulers or the authorities, right? If you go back to the Coptic and the Greek, that's the actual, way it was normally defined, as the rulers, right? Well, they ruled over us for a reason. That reason was to teach us. And now the student has risen to the level above the teacher. And so it's already happened. There's just not enough of us yet, but that's already changing. The critical mass is approaching, where there will be this moment where we will see so clearly through the MO, where there will be, like, say, they will manipulate plasma to create an alien invasion or a second coming, and there'll be enough of us that are going, nah, good effects, nice effects, but sorry, we don't buy it, because guess what? There is no savior. We're the ones that we've been waiting for, like the Hopi said. We're the savior. There is no savior coming. This is all part of that master race ideology that ends in an apocalyptic showdown where the righteous go to be with the higher being, and the bad ones are cast into hell forever and ever and ever, right? But he loves us, right? Never forget it, right? So, you can see how, like, silly and contradictory all of it is. This is their MO. Their MO is collapsing. It's only a matter of time, and we're moving into that Aquarian age, right? It's the age of Aquarius, right? Yeah. Right? But it's still 900 years away or 800 years away, right? So don't get your hopes up too fast. But there's going to be a pivotal moment, which is, which the Magi and the ancient Egyptians, they were using something called a Dendera zodiac. And that's a fascinating tool, man, because they could actually thousands of years ago, with this tool, predict what's going on in the world at very specific time. They could dial forward with that tool to 2024, and they could tell you pretty much exactly what we'd be going through right now as humanity, as our lessons. Right. And equally, they could dial back and they could, pinpoint certain things that happened in the history of humanity that led them to certain breakthroughs. And that Dendera tool is like a clock, and we're used to astrology pointing us in a certain direction. Right now, we're pointed in the age of Pisces, right? We're still in Pisces. Well, the Dendera zodiac had a second hand. It was the hour hand, right? And the second hand, the hour hand, it's funny that they knew this, but they could determine exactly where the center of our galaxy was over 2,000 years ago, Chris. Imagine that, right? Where did they get that intel? You have any idea when we found out in the modern time where the center of our galaxy was?
Probably not that long ago.
1972, yeah. I think it was, right? So, look, I think 4,000 years earlier, they knew stuff. And what I'm saying is that they knew that whenever this big hand, our hand, pointed at the center of the galaxy, and that's a measurable thing. They could precisely, it's not channeling, it's not like hocus pocus, it's like clockwork. Boom, there it is. And they could tell exactly when that's going to be, and that's going to be exactly in 192 years. So when that happens, whenever that happens, they call it the midnight hour. That's when the shit goes down. That's when the really big stuff happens, right? So we're already in the wake of that event, and we feel it. And I think that's what I think people are feeling when they're talking about, like the fifth dimension, the new world, all this stuff. We can feel that energy. That's part of this Aquarian, the flow of that Aquarian, it's the guy holding the water jug, right? Well, if you look at the star constellations and how that jug is sitting, the water's pouring out of that into the fish, into the mouth of the fish. So that we're already tasting that water. Those currents are already affecting us. And those of us who are ahead of our time are feeling it. And we're already, we can already tune in to that energy, and we can live our lives from that basis, from that point. And we don't have to get swept away by the coming drama of the apocalyptic showdown, because we can see it for the fraud that it is. And the more of us that see through the fraud, the less energy it has on the planet. And that's the point where I think we will finally reach that, that new earth. And that new earth, guess where it is? It's right here in the material realm, where it's been the whole time. We just haven't seen it. We haven't seen it yet,
It's all about peeling back those layers of perception. Frank, thank you so much. This was fantastic information. Before we close out, let everyone know how they can get access to the webinar. I'll have the link in the description as well, and find out more about you in general.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I guess the easiest way to go to the webinar page was cyberhive.tv. There's 2 other webinars up there as well that preceded it, but the newest one, this one, is the one I think you're going to want to check out, because it talks about all the stuff we just broached briefly on in this talk, in this hour. Time capsule for the future past. For those who are, want to see me in person, you never know, someone might actually want to risk seeing me in person. I'm going to be speaking at the Arlington Institute on the 16th, next Saturday, a week from Saturday, at Arlington, West Virginia. So if you want to come, maybe you can put that link in too. Like, if you can't make it, of course, I'll forgive you. But you can also tune in online, and you can watch the talk live online as well. So that'll be happening. That's something I wanted to mention as well, because I always tend to forget that. Otherwise, just go to frankjacob.com if you can't remember any of that, and I have links at the menu on the top of that to all of those things.
Perfect. I will include all those links in the description. Everybody can easily access that. Frank, thank you again. We'll definitely do this again in the future. And until next time, have a wonderful evening, everyone. We'll talk again tomorrow. See y'all then.